The ancient Greek religious tradition included a vast array of magical techniques through which it is believed that people could attain material enrichment and success, could discover hidden information, or can cause those they wanted to love them and those they hated to suffer or die. It seems likely that most people's religious beliefs and practices contained much that they may be categorized at the magical end of the spectrum. In an atmosphere of general uncertainty, insecurity, and helplessness, magic claimed to provide a method that worked directly and relatively, dependably, to solve all the problems, difficulties, and unfulfilled aspirations of everyday life. Firm evidence of belief in magical power and practice goes back to the earliest Greek literature, although this undoubtedly represents a far older tradition in prehistory. Circe, in Homer's Odyssey, for example, knows how to summon spirits of the dead and uses magic rituals to transform humans into animals, while in the myth, Medea possessed the power of the evil eye and can cause all manner of harm by magical means. Important references to magical practices and beliefs are found in literature from the entire span of the ancient Greek culture. For example, in Hesiod, Plato, Aristotle, Theocritus, Apollonius of Rhodes, Plutarch, Lucian, Plotinus, and Iamblichus. Knowledge derived from this material is supplemented by archaeological artifacts, and particularly curse tablets, figurines, and amulet gemstones. The most detailed information concerning magic in the older Hellenic tradition comes from the Greek magical papyri from Egypt and dates between the 2nd century BCE to the 5th century. This very rich collection of material demonstrates clearly that the Greek tradition of magic cannot be taken in isolation from the Egyptians, Jews, and other Eastern traditions, and confirms that the magic was practiced at many levels, from villages to courts, and by practitioners ranging from itinerant to highly institutionalized individuals. The magic revealed by these sources is primarily concerned with using the supernatural forces believed to control and influence the world in which humans exist, whether these are gods and goddesses, intermediary powers, such as angels, demons, deacons, spirits of the dead, and those associated with nature, such as solar and astral powers, feature prominently while in the papyri. With their particularly cultural context, the Jewish god Ya'al is the most frequently named, but in general, the forces of the underworld, notably Hecate, were undoubtedly those thought most helpful and potent. Magical practice, ranging from the crude and casual to elaborate and formal, was thought to be empowered in almost all cases by a combination of speech and ritual action, although sometimes no more than vestigial at a low level. These words and actions, which are often involved overt symbolic linkage to desired outcome, were underpinned at the most complex end of the scale by a vast system of knowledge of numerous levels of often highly individualized supernatural powers, and of the names, words, and practices to make the responsive or submissive. It was vital to know all natural materials, whether animal, vegetable, or mineral, thought to be particularly favorable or potent in relation to purposes of magic in hand, and either sympathetic or antipathetic to the powers being used. Important too was knowledge of correct timing, generally determined by complicated astrological lore and location. For example, the crossroads, or a place of a violent death. Just as most people today, however, use modern technology with almost no knowledge of the underlying science behind it, so most of the employed magical techniques in the ancient world had no real understanding of their formal and complex intellectual basis. Magical practice in the Greek tradition may be said to fall into one of three general categories: protection, manipulation, and the discovery of normally hidden knowledge. For protection, amulets were most commonly used. These operated at all levels, from individual and communal, and were either worn on the body or placed strategically on the doorpost of a house, for example, or on a city gate. All manner of materials were used, but all were thought to have some special, whether physical or symbolic. This might be increased by combining elements, by adding written formulae, and by preparing them at the proper time and place. Best known among enormous range of popular techniques of magical manipulation is the use of a curse tablet, or a voodoo doll. In the former case, magic formula most often inscribed on a lead tablet that was then associated with the enforcing powers by, for example, being inserted in a tomb or a burial at crossroads. The tablet was also frequently bound or fixed symbolically during the ritual, perhaps being tied with elaborately knotted thread or pierced with a nail. Practices involving magical figurines were generally similar, although wax or clay might be used, and rituals of piercing and binding were often more complicated. Symbolic melting or severing of the image might occur, and it might be associated with the victim by using personal materials and by inscribing personal names on specific body parts. In both cases, ritual action was carefully timed and located, and was accompanied by equally elaborate verbal elements. Such practices were believed to cause general loss of performance, overwhelming lust, or even death. These effects might extend not only to human but to livestock and crops as well. Other manipulatory techniques involving summoning and the compelling supernatural powers or spirits in their more elaborate forms, complex rituals of invocation took place, and the interaction with the powers might be thought to occur in a trance state or by means of visions seen, perhaps in a shining surface of a vessel of water or a mirror. The latter practices relate closely to some use for determining hidden knowledge. Also, related to these manipulatory techniques are the late antique rites of theurgy, talked about by Neoplatonists like Iamblichus. This is a form of divination. Divination, the supposed ability to acquire knowledge of the future or other normally inaccessible matters by supernatural means, has always found a place in the Greek tradition from antiquity to the present day. But while some forms have enjoyed cultural approval, others have been condemned. All the methods of divination in Greek tradition, from the most sophisticated to the most crude, operate on the same basic principle: the belief that the supernatural forces, whether gods, angels, demons, or spirits of the dead, endowed with greater understanding than humans, may reveal part of their superior knowledge through the phenomena being experienced or observed. Scholarship, following distinctions drawn in antiquity, has traditionally divided the methods of divination known in the Greek world between the natural or intuitive and the artificial or inductive. Such groupings, however, tend to be confusing, since even in the most apparently intuitive methods, some manipulation may be thought possible or necessary. They also impose a distinction not perceived by the great majority of actual participants, and have further been understood in different ways by different scholars. Oracular prophecy undoubtedly enjoyed the highest cultural esteem in the ancient Greek world. It was conducted at all manner of holy places, some of which transcended state boundaries and were highly institutionalized, although most were very local, catering to small communities and individuals. It also encompassed a broad spectrum of techniques, ranging from ecstatic utterance or frenzied behavior to the interpretations of the rustling leaves in a sacred tree or ripples in a sacred pool. The most famous site was Delphi, where Apollo was believed to speak through an inspired individual, the Pythia. But there were a number of other major oracles of similar standing, that of Zeus at Dodona, for example. At these important centers, a variety of complex rituals of consultation were conducted in elaborate physical surroundings to produce the oracular response. Questions were often posed by the representatives of cities and other such groups, and concerned important matters of state policy and law, although individuals might also make inquiries. Another type of oracle operating at high cultural level, and best exemplified by the tradition of the Sibylline ecstatic prophecy, did not offer answers to specific questions, but rather spoke generally about the future. Closely related to oracular prophecy was the interpretation of dreams, which were taken to be inspired by supernatural powers. At some major sites, and at great number of lesser ones, a god was believed to inspire the sick who slept there with dreams that either healed directly or told how to cure might be affected, incubation. Most notable perhaps was the shrine of Asclepius. People also commonly interpreted their own dreams as predictions of the future. Or else they might employ professionals who had training and access to the many textbooks of dream interpretation that developed over the centuries, and in some cases incorporated material from outside Greek tradition. Dreams interpretation illustrates quite clearly, the problems of drawing sharp distinctions between natural and artificial forms of divination. For although it might appear to be a purely intuitive technique, in many cases there was an obvious perception that dreams might be induced, either in the self or another, and the powers producing them manipulated. Related to this notion was a whole range of other divinatory techniques that involved the inducement of inspiration. Thus, in practices such as hydromancy, lectomancy, ketopromancy, where the behavior of objects or substances in a vessel of water was observed, or in more complex forms, medium saw visions on the surface of water or some other shining reflective material. It was believed that supernatural forces could be induced or forced by a diviner or a sorcerer to reveal hidden knowledge. Often these powers were thought to be the spirits of the dead, and hence such techniques were perceived to be forms of necromancy. Other common and highly developed methods of divination in the pre-Christian Greek world included augury, in which that believed the behavior of birds was noted, horoscopy, in which the behavior of sacrificial victims, and even more importantly, the formation, development, and marking of their various organs, such as the liver or shoulder blades, were observed. Also subject to interpretation were the chance utterances of people and involuntary movements of the body, such as twitching or sneezing, itching, as well as the patterns found on various parts of the body, like the palms, palm checking. Natural signs were thought to predict coming weather, while heavenly events from thunder and lightning to the appearance of comets and shooting stars were believed to be very significant. From Hellenistic times, the sometimes immensely complex and scientific technique of astrology developed under Eastern influence, using observation of the regular and irregular movements of heavenly bodies. This either predicted the future or determined the most appropriate course of timing of action. Other simple and consequently very common techniques involving the reading the pattern in which to cast objects, such as dice, grain, knuckle bones, or lots, fell, or the order in which they were extracted from a container. The point at which spinning objects stopped was believed to be revealing, for example, of the identity of a thief, and the significance might be derived from passages determined by some random method of selection in written text. With the rise of Christianity to dominance in the Greek world, the old, officially sanctioned forms of divination ceased to be culturally acceptable. Most had formally banned by the 4th century, and gradually fell into disuse. Oracular prophecy thus almost completely disappeared as a result of the Church's need to preserve the authority of its canon, despite having enjoyed some prominence in the form of directly inspired utterance in primitive Christianity, and in some heretical sects, the various types of divination related to animal sacrifice also vanished, along with the sacrificial rituals themselves. But although the new Christian orthodoxy claimed that all forms of pagan divination were evil and nothing but vehicles of demonic deceit, practice at popular level dictated that some at least would continue relatively unchanged. In the public sphere, incubation, for example, carried on without interruption, churches taking the place of pagan shrines and Christian holy figures, substituting as the source of inspiration. There is also abundant evidence throughout the Byzantine times and down to modern period that very many of the more private individual forms of divination continued to be practiced, and not only at local level, but sometimes even such places as the imperial cult itself. Mysticism, in fact, characteristic of the Greeks not to have invented a separate abstract term for the kind of experience they deemed inseparable from true philosophy and theology. What we do have in Greek are terms for mystery, mystic, and mystical, deriving from the verb muain, to close the eye, to initiate into the mysteries. Those terms denote that which is hidden, that which lies beyond the realm of ordinary existence. In this video, we are looking at the broad definition of mysticism, the quest for an experience of unmediated contact with the divine, alongside the anthropomorphic polytheism of Greek religion. There was an alternative form of religion, represented by the mystery cults. These offered a direct apprehension of the divine unattainable within civil religion. Of these cults, the Eleusinian and Dionysian mysteries are of particular importance. The origins of the Eleusinian mysteries are pre-Hellenic. They consisted in the reenactment of the myth of Demeter, the Earth Mother, and her daughter, Kore, or Persephone. They involved several stages of initiation, producing fellowship with the goddess and culminating with the beholding of the revelation of these deities at the shrine of Eleusis. The Dionysian mysteries went beyond the Eleusinian in seeking actual possession by and union with Dionysus. This was to be attained through rites of an orgiastic character and an outgoing of consciousness or ecstasy. Both cults were associated with the triumph over death and rebirth into immortality. The myth of the death and rebirth of Dionysus became a prominent feature of the Orphic movement, active from the 6th century BCE. The Orphics sought deliverance from the cycle of transmigration and reincarnation through union with the divine, understood not merely as a transient ecstatic experience, but as a permanent state of blessedness. Plato's philosophy has a profound mystical element. His philosophy was preeminently a way, a means whereby a man might require true participatory knowledge of the real, the eternal. The way's end is variously described. It is being in the Phaedo, the good in the Republic, beauty in the Symposium and the Phaedrus, and the one in the Philebus. Unawakened to the real, eternal world, man perceives only the phenomenal world, the world of sense perception. In his famous cave simile, Plato compares the situation of the unawakened to men shackled in a cave, able to see only the shadows of those who pass by behind them. Reawakened to the real world, the nominal world of ideal forms, is a painful but necessary experience. From that awakening, one must strive for the apprehension of the transcendent reality that is the source of all that is. This way of contemplation and the intuitive participatory knowledge is a guiding principle in Plato's work. It is, for example, the way that the rulers of the city-state must follow. It was to be an important influence in shaping the Christian mystical tradition. The mystical way, enunciated so clearly by Plato, suffuses much of the Hellenistic philosophical tradition. Aristotle, notwithstanding the many differences he had with his master, speaks of the contemplative life as a participation in the divine life, in which subject-object distinction between man and the divine disappears. Successors of Plato elaborated the mystical element in his work. The Stoicized form of Platonism, known as Middle Platonism, which held sway roughly from the 1st century BCE to the 3rd century of the Common Era, developed a much clearer idea of the transcendence of God, as opposed to the divine that found in Plato himself. It was against this intellectual background that many of the most outstanding examples of Hellenic mysticism emerge. The work of Philo of Alexandria from the 1st century represents a form of Judaism profoundly shaped by Middle Platonism of his day. Philo presents God as a radically unknowable in himself, but made known in his powers or operations. This distinction, not original to Philo, was to have a long and eventful history. For Philo, God reveals himself according to man's capacity to apprehend him. To describe this process of revelation, Philo does use the language of the mystery religions, although he was not directly influenced by them. He describes the soul's journey to God as beginning with conversion and the recognition of the createdness of the universe. Through moral purity, the soul comes to know itself and to recognize its utter dependence upon God. Knowledge of God is a divine grace, not a natural capacity. It entails a going out of oneself, a form of ecstasy seen most clearly in the Hebrew prophets. The shining of the light of God within entails suspension of the faculties, entails ecstasy and divine possession and madness. In such a state, the soul is superior to man but less than God. The Hermetic movement that developed in Egypt in the first 3 centuries of the Christian era made some of the Egyptian religion and certainly drew upon Judaism, but was profoundly Hellenic in inspiration. The Hermetic texts present a guide to mystical experience, viewed from a variety of standpoints. They speak of God as ineffable, but unknowable by man by virtue of man's divine nature. The great evil is ignorance. The mystical way consists, therefore, the reacquisition of self-knowledge, which is knowledge of the divine, and the ascent to ecstatic vision of God in which man is deified, or rather realizes his own divinity. The extraordinarily complex and seductive set of traditions known as Gnosticism posed a grave threat to Christianity in the first 3 centuries of the Christian era. While teachings and practices vary greatly, Gnosticism was essentially an attempt to present Christianity as a mystery religion, analogous to the mysteries of Mithras, Cybele, and Isis that were flourishing at that time. Teaching a radical form of dualism between God and the world, the Gnostics offered an initiatory form of knowledge, gnosis, whereby those who had a divine spark within them might escape from the material world and find salvation. Gnostic dualism found a new expression in the 3rd century with the rise of the Manichaean religion. The finest example of Hellenic mysticism is to be found in the teachings of Plotinus from the 3rd century, founder of a tradition known as Neoplatonism, the student of Ammonius of Alexandria. Plotinus took up the perception of the transcendence of God found in Middle Platonism and developed it out into a thoroughgoing statement of divine incomprehensibility. Plotinus's teaching is centered around the soul's ascent to reunion with the One. We know from his biographer, Porphyry, that Plotinus himself experienced mystical union with the One on several occasions. Plotinus teaches a way whereby the obscurities of the material life might be removed and the return to God accomplished. Plotinus had far more positive attitude to the material world than the Gnostics did, but is at the same time unequivocal in his understanding that the material is to be left behind on the soul's journey back to God. The return to the contemplation of God in Plotinus is also the return to oneself. It is a return to the vision of light, in which the subject-object distinction between man and God disappears, in which the soul becomes that light, being raised to godhood, or better, knowing its godhood. Center coincides with center. This is the life of the gods and of the godlike, and the blessed among them. Liberation from the alien matter that besets us here, a life taking no pleasure of the things of the earth, the passing of the alone to the alone. The Christian mystical tradition took up and reshaped many features of the mysticism of Hellenistic period, being principally indebted to Philo and Plotinus. Indeed, while Philo's influence on the Jewish tradition was initially minimal, and many of Plotinus' successors lapsed into theurgy, or magic, it was the Christians who preserved many of the insights of these two great teachers within the context of a living tradition. Clement of Alexandria integrated much of Philo's mystical teaching within the Christian tradition, most notably the motif of the divine darkness on Mount Sinai, used to express God's incomprehensibility. Clement went beyond Philo in speaking quite unambiguously of man's deification. Like Philo, Clement used the language of the pagan mysteries to describe the mysteries of his own faith. Here's what Clement has to say. O truly holy mysteries, O light undefiled, I am led by the torchbearer to be initiated into heaven and God. Though initiation I become holy, the Lord is my hierophant, and as one who leads by light, photogogus, seals the votary for himself. We should not forget how attractive this sort of language would have been to a 2nd century Alexandrian ear. Origen's work was deeply mystical character, something that those familiar only with his On the First Principle and Contra Calcem would know. For Origen, the mystical life is a realization of the union with Christ effected at baptism. His commentary and homilies on the Song of Songs develop this theme. Origen takes Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs to refer to 3 stages of the ascent to God, that is, the acquisition of the virtues to the proper understanding of the natural world, and finally, contemplation of God. In this understanding, the goal of the mystical life is union with the spiritual intellect, or nous, to God through contemplation. It does not entail ecstasy. The Alexandrian mystical tradition formed a crucial component of the teaching of the Cappadocian Fathers. This is evident in St. Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses. It is also apparent in the works of Evagrius of Pontus and Pseudo-Macarius. Evagrius made Origen's threefold distinction of the spiritual life classic. He also refrains from speaking about ecstasy. Macarius is less reserved and speaks of the intellect as utterly dispended and ravished, carried away by prayer and become one with it. He also follows Clement and Philo in using the phrase sober drunkenness, a motif avoided by both Origen and Evagrius. There was a danger in the Christian usage of the Hellenic mystical tradition that the mystical life would be seen as circular, as an escape from matter and a return to the pre-cosmic unity. This element of circulatory is palpable in the teachings of Origen and Evagrius. It is avoided by the Cappadocians and by Macarius in the emphasis on personhood and the integrity of the body. Union with God in these writers has no connotations into the divine. The teachings of the Pseudo-Dionysus, deeply influenced by the Neoplatonism of Plotinus and Proclus, do not adequately avoid the dangers of circularity. While their wonderful evocations of the super-irrational and the ecstatic apprehension of God in the state of perfect unknowing were to be enormously influential, they lacked the personalistic element so vital to true Christian mysticism.